did you know? There were numerous scrap versions of Resident Evil 4 developed as far back as 1998, 7 years before the final game's release. At the request of producer Shinji Mikami, the first version was directed by Hideki Kamiya following his success directing Resident Evil 2. Wanting to do something different, Kamiya tried to defy the series' conventions by ditching the tank controls and fixed camera angles. In its place would be a fast-paced, stylish action game starring a superhuman protagonist originally named Tony. Resident Evil 3 scenario writer Yasuhisa Kawamura recalled, "Mikami told Kamiya to do as he wanted, so he did. The game ended up being nothing like a Resident Evil game at all. Mikami was angry about it at first, but we couldn't afford to scrap the project. Thus, the game was reworked as an original title, which would ultimately become Devil May Cry." Afterwards, Mikami tasked artist Hiroshi Shibata with directing the game's next iteration. Kawamura joined Shibata's team, hoping to fix the Resident Evil series, especially in the face of Silent Hill. Kawamura felt the horror portion of Resident Evil was in a rut. He told Eurogamer, "Resident Evil's mystery is dependent upon science and forensic fiction, and that challenges humans to understand the concept fully. Silent Hill's notion of horror was based on hallucinations and ghosts. There's no explanation behind these things. This concept on its own would forever be unknown territory, impossible to comprehend and impossible to predict. I told Shibata, if we want to pursue pure horror, we need to find an unexplainable concept. Let's create a setting that doesn't revolve around science or reason." Inspired by the 2000 film Lost Souls, Kawamura came up with the idea of Leon being infected with a mysterious virus and plagued by hallucinations. Players would also be relentlessly pursued by a ghostly man wielding a hook. This iteration of the game, dubbed the Hookman version by some, was introduced by Mikami at E3 2003. However, in spite of Mikami's claims that the project was proceeding very smoothly, the game was in deep trouble. Kawamura didn't want players to know when Leon's hallucination would happen, so hidden checkpoints would trigger Leon's hallucinations. And depending on the player's behavior, the structure of the world would change. This meant the team had to create 2 sets of 3D models for everything, one for the real world and one for hallucinations. This doubled the development cost and was difficult to fit into the GameCube's RAM. The team tried reworking the project several times over to save it, and considered featuring a single monster throughout the entirety of the game at one point. And despite their efforts, Mikami ultimately stepped in and took over development, creating the Resident Evil 4 we know today. Kawamura confessed it was disappointing and discouraging. "I still think the idea was brilliant, but I didn't have enough skill or guts to put the plan into action. I don't know if I could have done anything to prevent that occurrence. I just wanted to make a scary Resident Evil game." Interestingly, references to Shibata and Kawamura's version of Resident Evil 4 can be found in the debug menu of the Resident Evil 4 preview disc. A list of stages can be found in the debug menu, which include references to areas from trailers of scrap versions of the game, such as Taxidermy Room, Doll Room, and Airship Corridor. Despite the project's shortcomings, Kawamura wasn't the only one who felt RE4 needed to overhaul the series. Producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi also noticed that the Resident Evil games were recycling the same ideas to the point that Capcom staff became bored working on them, and would transfer to different projects. Kobayashi approached Mikami to figure out how they could make a game to please old fans as well as make new ones. Following the mild commercial failure of his own Resident Evil remake in 2002, Mikami decided to take the series in a more action-packed direction. Mikami told IGN, "With Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, and all the rest of the series before Resident Evil 4, I was always saying to the staff, scaring the player is the #1 thing. But for the first time in Resident Evil 4, I told the team that fun gameplay was the most important thing. That all came out of the commercial failure of the Resident Evil remake." One of Mikami's most crucial decisions was to change the game's camera system. Earlier Resident Evil 4 builds had an over-the-shoulder camera for combat, but the idea to use the camera throughout the entire game was inspired by Mikami playing Onimusha 3 Demon Siege. Though he enjoyed the game, he couldn't shake the feeling that it would have been better if the camera was placed behind the character. While the camera system changed, Resi 4 still uses tank controls, contrary to popular belief. For instance, the player can only move forwards or backwards, while right and left only serve to turn the player in that respective direction. In fact, the game switches to a fixed camera perspective during the Ashley segment exclusively in the Japanese version of the game. Although this throwback was cut from the Western releases, various fans such as YouTuber Gary STZ have modded fixed camera angles into the game with surprising success. At one point in development, the team considered adding the ability to strafe, but the feature was dropped after developers felt the addition made the game feel too much like a military shooter rather than a Resident Evil game. Although RE4 originally started out as a PlayStation 2 game, Mikami reportedly became frustrated with the console by late 2000 and began looking towards competing hardware. Catching wind of this, Microsoft quickly set up a meeting with Mikami on Christmas Day in 2000, hoping to woo the director into bringing the famous survival horror series to the Xbox. Although the entire meeting was conducted in Japanese, Japanese, Xbox's then director of third-party relations, Kevin Backus, was kept up to date in person via written notes. This only bought him a front seat ticket to watch the potentially monumental deal go up in flames right before his eyes. While things started out smoothly, Mikami became skeptical of if the game would perform well on Xbox, which hadn't even launched and faced an uphill battle in Japan. He asked what Xbox had to offer him and his team, telling Xbox Japan, "What is your philosophy? Sony says games are entertainment, something larger, fueled by the emotion engine. Nintendo says games are toys created by the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto, perhaps the greatest game developer of all time. What do you feel?" After Microsoft's team failed to come up with an answer, he promptly stood up, bowed, and left. Backus lamented, "I almost jumped out the window because we had said repeatedly that we aspire to enable games that could be considered art, much like film. That because of the maturity of the development tools and the APIs and the power of the technology, game developers on Xbox would be able to concentrate on the features that elevated games to being something more than they were otherwise." So the guy who reported to me said, "Oh, that's so great, I wish I had known that." But unfortunately, it was too late. In a desperate bid to save the deal, Backus ordered Pat Ahura, the figurehead of Xbox's Japan division at the time, to board the next train to Osaka and smooth things over with Mikami. However, by the time Ahura arrived, Mikami had already met up with Nintendo and agreed to develop Resident Evil 4 for the GameCube. Resi 4 went on to become the headliner for the Capcom 5 deal in 2002, where Capcom agreed to produce 5 games exclusively for the GameCube. However, Capcom backpedaled on the deal later that year, claiming only Resident Evil 4 would remain an exclusive. When asked if RE4 would ever be ported to the PlayStation 2, Kobayashi responded, definitely not, it's a GameCube exclusive." Mikami even said he would cut his own head off should the game ever be released on any other platform. Nevertheless, just a few months before the game's release on the GameCube, Capcom announced that Resident Evil 4 would be headed to the PlayStation 2 by the end of 2005. In fact, the game would go on to be ported to the Wii, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, iOS, Android, and PC twice over. A port even made its way to the obscure Zibo console in Brazil. This statement was referenced in Mikami's next game, God Hand, which included a racing dog named Mikami's Head. Resident Evil 4 had struggled with censorship in various parts of the world. For example, it's impossible to blow off the heads of enemies in the Japanese versions of the game. Due to this, Japanese players can never see the game's Ganados walk without their heads. Similarly, while the game's infamous chainsaw death animation is still present, Leon's head does not get torn off in the Japanese release. The death animation of the Plagas were toned down as well. These changes were made due to the Japanese games ratings board Sero's list of banned expressions. This list includes restrictions on the expression of mutilation/body cutting that gives an extremely cruel impression among many others. Meanwhile, the German version of Resident Evil 4 kept the decapitations. However, the Assignment Ada and Mercenaries modes were cut entirely. It's speculated that this change was made as the minigames could be interpreted as glorifying senseless violence. Whatever the case, the uncut version of the game was placed on Germany's list of media harmful to young people, commonly known as the Index, where it faced strict regulations. The game remained on the Index for over a decade, forcing Capcom to censor 2014's Resident Evil 4 Ultimate HD Edition in Germany as well, until it was finally removed from the list and subsequently restored in 2016. Violence wasn't the only issue with censors either. According to Censored Gaming, Ashley Graham's breast physics vary between releases. For example, the physics in the Japanese and European GameCube releases are noticeably toned down compared to the North American GameCube version. On the other hand, the PS2 release removed the physics altogether worldwide. Resident Evil 4 has its fair share of Easter eggs. The name of the Killer 7 handgun is a reference to Suda51's game of the same name, which Mikami co-wrote and produced. The gun also bears a resemblance to Killer 7's Katie Smith's AMT Hardballer. Meanwhile, the description on the Broken Butterfly reads, "A very powerful .45 Magnum revolver. This will make anyone's day." The last line is likely an homage to Clint Eastwood's famous line in Dirty Harry,
"Go ahead, make my day."
Another Easter egg laid undiscovered for nearly 12 years after the game's release. On January 4th, 2017, YouTuber SR212787 found a 2D image of a person in a green jacket hidden far off in the distance during a segment of the game in Chapter 5.4. Although the discovery made waves through the gaming community, Capcom has remained silent on the matter and the identity of the person remains a mystery to this day. Did you also know that fan art was accidentally used in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate? For more facts, check out the DidYouKnowGaming video on Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And hey, I finally beat Resident Evil 4 after being on my game shelf for probably a few decades. So if you're into that sort of thing, here's me talking about my experience with the game as a first-timer.